Before we start this episode, I'd just like to acknowledge the 70 different traditional owner groups whose sea country makes up the Great Barrier Reef and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Hello and welcome to Word on the Reef, a podcast where we take the plunge into one of the world's most spectacular natural wonders, the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef, along with many coral reefs around the world, has just experienced its worst summer on record, with cyclones, severe rainfall, flooding, and its most extreme coral bleaching event ever, with water temperatures the warmest on record. According to the Reef Authority and the Australian Institute of Marine Science, 3/4 of surveyed reefs experienced bleaching, with the majority experiencing high to extreme levels of bleaching, particularly in the southern section of the reef. We learned more about coral bleaching, what causes it, and what it takes for the reef to recover back in episode 2. So if you haven't already, I highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode first. But basically, climate change caused by the mining and burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil and gas is heating up our planet and our oceans, causing corals to get sick and turn white in a phenomenon known as coral bleaching. The reef is huge and there are still healthy parts for us to visit and enjoy. However, these increasingly severe and frequent bleaching events are an urgent warning to humanity that we must reduce our reliance on fossil fuels to combat climate change and give the reef a chance for the future. Australia is in the spotlight, not only because we're the custodians of the reef, but also because our nation is one of the highest per capita carbon emitters and the second largest exporter of coal in the world. The World Heritage Committee has expressed concerns that Australia isn't doing enough to protect the reef, particularly regarding its climate policies. World Heritage listing is granted by the World Heritage Committee under the guidance of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, UNESCO, and recognises natural and cultural places of outstanding universal value. Countries with World Heritage properties must report regularly to UNESCO on the state of their properties. If the World Heritage Committee considers the values of a listed place as being impacted, the committee may list that property as in danger. Back in episodes 9 and 10, we learned about the establishment of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park in 1975, and since then, Australia has made significant efforts to protect the reef, including banning oil drilling and coral mining, establishing a comprehensive management framework, declaring highly protected green zones covering 1/3 of the entire reef, and supporting world-leading scientific research. But at its July meeting in India, the World Heritage Committee noted that the reef, quote, remains under serious threat, and gave Australia until February next year to improve its reef management and climate policies, or risk a possible in danger listing. But what does that mean? To give us the lowdown, our guest today is Dr. John Day. A recipient of the Australian Public Service Medal, John worked on the Great Barrier Reef for 28 years, including 16 years as one of the directors for the Marine Park Authority. John was also appointed as one of 3 experts on the Australian delegation to the World Heritage Committee for 4 years in 2007. Now retired, John continues to contribute to research and conservation. We couldn't have a better expert to explain to us the story of the reef's World Heritage values. Dr. John Day, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Tanya.
So why is the Great Barrier Reef such a significant World Heritage Site, and why is its health such a topic of nationwide and global concern?
So the Great Barrier Reef was formally recognised in 1981 because it was acknowledged back then that it was outstanding under all 4 natural criteria. And the natural advisory body is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN. And they wrote back then in 1981, if any coral reef in the world were to be chosen for the World Heritage List, the Great Barrier Reef is a site. So it's always been acknowledged as of international significance. And the reason it's so impressive is that just its sheer size, when you think about it, it extends over 14 degrees of latitude. So that huge area contains some amazing biodiversity. And it's probably the most important World Heritage property on the planet in terms of its species biodiversity. Within the Great Barrier Reef, we have 56% of all the world's hard coral species. We have 6 of the world's 7 species of marine turtles. We have over half of the world's mangrove biodiversity. And we have seabird breeding colonies of world significance, dugong populations. Those sort of things make it of outstanding universal value. So it's not the largest World Heritage property, but it's probably one of the most important, and it's probably also one of the better known. But on top of that, the economic value, over $6 billion to the Australian economy every year. Then there's the other sort of social and cultural benefits as well. So, if you talk to the Indigenous people who have lived here for thousands of years and talk about the values of the area, their whole culture is built around, or many of the coastal ones, their culture is built around a healthy barrier reef. So we're impacting cultural values, we're impacting social values of local GBR communities, we're certainly impacting economic values, but we're also, just the whole Australian identity. Yep. That's why I think Australians do care. That's why they supported the initial proclamation when the Great Barrier Reef was initially declared in 1975. Australians have been proud of the fact that it's this amazing place that they feel so strongly about. So I think they are concerned about the values declining. They'd like to see it fixed.
It's not the only coral reef to be World Heritage listed, is it?
No, there's something like 21 different World Heritage properties that have coral, but many of them are also undergoing the same sort of pressures that the Great Barrier Reef is under. And 12 out of those 21 World Heritage coral reef areas are showing impacts of bleaching, more than 15-degree heating weeks on the NOAA website. So this is really of concern. So when we talk about impacts on coral reefs, it's not just the Great Barrier Reef that's suffering, it's coral reefs around the world.
Yeah, we're extremely lucky that we have such a well-protected reef, which has kept it in such pristine condition for so many years, especially compared to some other less protected reefs around the world. But the most recent report from UNESCO and IUCN recommended a possible in danger listing for the Great Barrier Reef. So what does in danger listing mean?
Okay, well, in danger listing is a term used in the World Heritage process. Effectively, it's not a sanction or a punishment. It's a call to action. So it means that the World Heritage property has been recognised as being under threat, and it does require some actions to protect it, particularly for future generations. So currently on the World Heritage list, there are something like 1,199 properties. But of those, 56 of them are currently listed on another list called the World Heritage in Danger list. So as I said, in danger is designed to inform the international community that the values within that property are threatened, and it's trying to encourage corrective action. So it's a pretty powerful tool to rally international attention and get some action. So this proposal for in danger listing, this isn't just something that's happened recently. In fact, the first time the Great Barrier Reef was listed for possible in danger was in 2012. And so we've had, I think, 4 instances since then where the same draft decision has called for possible in danger listing, depending on what actions were taken. But the other thing, Tanya, I should stress, it's not just the in danger that we should be worried about. There are a whole lot of issues facing the reef, and the World Heritage Committee's been worried about the reef right since it was inscribed. So back in the 1980s, some of your listeners will remember a thing called the Cape Tribulation Road, which was very controversial. That raised some concerns back then, not about in danger, but it just raised concerns in the committee. And then in the mid-90s, there were concerns about many of the tourist resorts. And in the late 90s, the NGOs really got involved, and they were starting to agitate about things like catchment issues and ship safety, because we'd had some major groundings, and the need for resources. And it was interesting, a couple of years later, we had the major grounding on Sudbury Cay. So these are some of the issues that the committee's been worried about right throughout the decades, but it was only the proposals for, or the developments that happened on Curtis Island that really led to what they call a mission to come out, and they were the first ones to call for a possible in danger listing in 2012.
What happened on Curtis Island?
So Curtis Island was a proposal for a LNG processing plant, which many people thought was outside the World Heritage Area because it was outside the marine park. But the Curtis Island is actually part of the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area.
Whereabouts is
so
it?
This is down near Gladstone, near the port of Gladstone, just offshore.
Okay.
So there was 4 major proposals down there. Many of them went ahead, and today there's a huge LNG processing plant on the island, and there's been major reclamations in the port of Gladstone as a result of that. Mm. And so this really brought the issue of development in the World Heritage Area, really brought into close sort of focus the issues, and the World Heritage Committee sent out a mission, and they went back, and the result of that 2011 mission report was a draft decision to say possible in danger listing. Now, that didn't happen, but for the next couple of years, 2012, 2013 and 2014, that same wording appeared in the draft decision for the World Heritage Area, talking about possible in danger listing, unless clear progress could be shown. And in each case, the Australian government has managed to evade in danger listing, but as you indicated, it's coming up yet again. So there was a mission in 2022. Again, they recommended possible in danger listing.
Wow. So what are the main concerns currently under consideration? Obviously, you said it was about Curtis Island back in 2012. That project went ahead, but what's the main issues now?
The committee has been kept informed by a number of things. You're probably aware the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority puts out its 5-yearly outlook report. The 5-yearly outlook report talked about 4 main threats facing the Great Barrier Reef, climate change being the number one threat, but also water quality, poor water quality coming off the land, unsustainable fishing practices, and unsustainable coastal development. So those are the 4 big issues. But the outlook report also actually mentioned 45 different possible threats. So the World Heritage Committee has been kept well informed about the possible threats. And in their last draft decision, they talked about the lack of progress in addressing water quality, the major concerns about climate change still impacting. And so they're raising a lot of the issues that we know here in North Queensland and have been articulated in the outlook report. So what effectively the committee has said is we want to have a report on how things are being addressed by Australia, and depending on the outcome, they may decide to inscribe the Great Barrier Reef on the World Heritage List in danger.
Yeah, so the World Heritage Committee also is waiting for the scientists to compile the final mortality data from this year's bleaching before it revisits the possible in danger decision again next year. And most of the data we currently have is from surveys that were conducted before or during the bleaching. So we don't actually know how many of those bleached corals have died. But what we do know is that it was the most extreme heat stress event ever. So once the scientists start surveying the reef from September onwards to assess the death rate or mortality, it's likely to be quite significant. Meanwhile, the World Heritage Committee has clearly stated it wants the Australian government to aim for higher greenhouse gas cuts to help keep average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C, a critical threshold for the survival of coral reefs. That would mean Australia committing to net zero emissions by 2035, and the OECD's Conservative International Energy Agency has said we cannot start any new fossil fuel projects if we are to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees and give the world's coral reefs a chance for the future. UNESCO has also asked the Australian government to do more to address local threats such as overfishing, water pollution, and tree clearing. Although regulations have helped to reduce the amount of agricultural fertilisers flowing into the reef waters over recent years, progress has been too slow, and during that time, tens of thousands of hectares of trees have been cleared along rivers, streams, and coastal wetlands leading to the reef. Trees in those locations help to filter pollution and reduce sediment flowing into reef waters. So the committee has asked the Australian government to close the loopholes which are allowing tree clearing to continue at such alarming rates in those areas. So there's a lot of things that Australia has been asked to do and report back on next February. But if the Great Barrier Reef is inscribed on the in danger list, what might that mean?
Well, I want to make a couple of points. In danger isn't a sort of forever listing. In danger, as I said, is not a permanent thing. It's the sort of thing where the committee says we are concerned about impacts upon values. However, if you do certain things, then you can come off the in danger list. And there are many examples of countries that have been on the in danger list and then come off. Probably the most recent and most relevant example is the Belize Barrier Reef in Central America, which was listed for a number of things back in 2009 to 2018. And they were worried about things like oil exploration and mangroves being cut down in the area, lack of proper environmental impact assessment. So a lot of these were addressed in the draft decision, and the country of Belize effectively addressed them to the point where they convinced the World Heritage Committee to take them off the endangered list, and now they're back on just the normal World Heritage list. So I do want to stress endangered is not forever. And the other point that some people get confused is the comparison of the endangered listing, which is not permanent, with delisting, which is a permanent label. If your property is delisted, that means you've lost the values for which you're inscribed on the World Heritage List. And if you're delisted, and only 3 properties have ever been delisted, then you're basically struck through. They put a line through the name on the World Heritage List. You stay there, but they say delisted date such and such. So there is a difference. Now, if the Great Barrier Reef goes on the endangered list, it'll be made pretty clear they have to address certain things and continue to report. And then they'll stay on the endangered list for as long as the committee believes they're not addressing or producing actions to address those concerns. But if they are addressing those actions, then they can come off the list as soon as the committee believes it's no longer in danger. So Australia, as you know, regularly submits a progress report saying what they're doing. They've got this major Reef 2050 long-term sustainability plan and lots of other actions to address things like water quality. But sadly, the government's own monitoring is showing they're not achieving some of their targets, for example, for water quality. So things like sediment loads and nutrient loads are not achieving the targets they set themselves when these were first delivered in the long-term plan. And instead of changing the way they're addressing it, in some cases they're actually tweaking the targets.
Changing the goalposts to make it easier for themselves to meet them.
Well, yeah. But I mean, the other point I'd say is that we've got a lot of efforts, a lot of money, huge amounts of funding going into the reef. But the results aren't what are needed, nor what the government was originally hoping for. And in many cases, it's about ineffective delivery. They're doing things on either too small a scale or not in the right places. And we haven't got good compliance. So, it's no use having regulations if there's ineffective enforcement and compliance. And so an example of that is most farmers have taken on board the rules around appropriate use of fertilizer and things like that. But those who are flouting the rules aren't getting anything more than a basic slap on the wrist. And so, there's no incentive for a lot of people to do the right thing when they see other people doing the wrong thing. So back to endanger, what's it going to mean? What it really means is that there's this international spotlight even more focused on the Great Barrier Reef. And in the past, having that possible endanger listing has also been a really good spotlight. And so we've seen a lot of government action and funding as a result of that spotlight from the World Heritage Committee. So say, for example, the strategic assessment in 2013 and then the long-term sustainability plan that came out of it, the Reef 2050 plan, those were both as a result of that international spotlight from the World Heritage Committee. The amount of funding that's gone into the reef has also been, on a global scale, amazing. And many of your listeners will be aware of the $440 million that was given to the Great Barrier Reef Foundation back in 2018. That was primarily because of the international spotlight on the reef because of the possible endanger listing. So even if it's not listed in danger, having that draft decision saying about a possible inscription has had benefits.
Tell us about some of the other sites that are already on the endanger list and how those countries are handling it.
If we look at the 56 countries that are currently on the endanger list, there are many that people would know well. So the rainforests of Sumatra, Indonesia, they're on the endanger list. Everglades National Park in the USA, that's on the endanger list. The historic centre of Vienna is on the endanger list. So it's a range of properties, not just the ones in the Congo where the conflict is having an impact on the gorillas, or the ones in the Ukraine I mentioned before. On our doorstep here in the Solomon Islands, there's a property called East Rennell, which is on the endanger list. So many of these are in developing countries where they don't have resources, but places like Vienna and Everglades are obvious exceptions. So in fact, the Everglades is a really interesting one. The American government has a totally different attitude towards World Heritage in danger than, say, the Australian government. The Everglades was initially on the endanger list in 1993, and it was removed from the endanger list in 2009. But immediately the federal government the following year requested to go back on the endanger list in 2010 because they saw what endanger allowed them to do to try and address the impacts on the Everglades, which was mainly due to water management or mismanagement coming from the state of Florida. So here is a federal agency or federal government in the US requesting a property go on the endanger list because they saw the benefits of endanger listing.
So they saw the benefit as raising awareness and attracting attention and getting the necessary action to protect the property.
That's exactly right. So it's very different to how the Australian government is regarding potential endanger listing for Australian World Heritage.
How is the Australian and Queensland governments reacting to the current suggestion of endanger listing for the reef?
Well, they're pushing back and they're saying, we're spending all this money and doing all these things and it's not in danger. But I think the saying it's not in danger is contrary to their own outlook reports. The 5-yearly outlook report, which comes out legally required for the Great Barrier Reef every 5 years. So the first one, 2009, said the overall outlook for the Great Barrier Reef was poor. The next one came out in 2014, similarly said the outlook for the reef is poor. The last one, 2019, actually said it's now very poor and the outlook is deteriorating. So the Australian government's own report is saying the values for which it was inscribed on World Heritage, not all, but some of those values are deteriorating. Their own report shows this. And so there's no doubt that the values for which it was inscribed on the World Heritage List are in danger. Whether that then leads to an endanger listing is up to the committee, but the government's own reports are basically showing that they are on a downward trajectory, which is not good.
Yeah, so why do you think they are pushing back against an endanger listing? Is it just thought to bring bad publicity?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. One, the government doesn't like to admit that they failed, particularly as they've spent so much money, and literally we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. But as I said earlier, some of that money I don't think has been well spent. But I think it's mainly for many years, and I was part of it, we said the Great Barrier Reef was the best protected, best managed marine protected area in the world. And for many years it was. But that's sort of sticking your head in the sand and ignoring the fact that today things like climate change combined with water quality, so it's the cumulative impact of many pressures. We can't just point at one thing like saying shipping incidents or unsustainable fishing. It's the combined or the cumulative impacts of all these together that are having the long-term degradation of the values. And so that's the thing that the Australian government, I think, is not facing up to, that their own reports are showing the values are going down, and yet they won't accept that in endanger listing. Endanger isn't going to fix the problem. Endanger is just going to bring a much greater international spotlight onto the issue. And perhaps that's, as one of the tourist operators said, that's what we need. And I also want to stress that the Great Barrier Reef isn't the first Australian property to be under the possible endanger listing. Kakadu, back in the late 1990s, was under the possible endanger listing, and Australia fought really hard to have Kakadu not put on the endanger list. And in fact, the level of response back in the late 1990s to that endanger possible listing still reverberates today within the World Heritage Centre and the advisory bodies. Australia lobbied so hard against that endanger listing, they really went across the line, and it wasn't a particularly nice time.
What do you think will be the best case scenario to come out of all of what's happening around this endanger listing?
I think one of the things that we have to try and convince not just Australians and the international community is that all World Heritage properties are being impacted by climate change. The Great Barrier Reef is just sort of the poster child because it's so obvious with the bleaching that's occurred and things like that. But I mentioned before, my colleagues are talking about over half of the 21 World Heritage coral reefs are showing impacts of bleaching currently. It's not just coral reefs, it's the whole range of things that are associated with reefs. So, fish and invertebrates that depend on reefs, they are impacted. But it's other things as well. Things like seagrass, they're being impacted. So we're seeing huge flow-on impacts from climate change. And as I said, it's not just the Great Barrier Reef, it's virtually every World Heritage property. And beyond World Heritage, it's having impact on cultural and natural heritage. I was doing some work with some Indigenous colleagues up near Cooktown, and they talk about their seasonal calendar, which has been developed over thousands of years and helps them pass on their traditions. Their seasonal calendar is all out of whack, to use their words, because of climate change. So this is really important. And what might happen, or we hope will happen, is that the World Heritage Committee will recognise that climate change really is having a major impact on World Heritage and can convince a lot of countries and state parties to actually start doing appropriate levels of action instead of business as usual. Australia, we're a lucky country, but we've got one of the highest per capita emission rates in the world. So we've really got to step up and take action. We can't keep ducking and saying, oh, it's someone else's problem or someone else has to do before we will. We can't keep approving new coal and gas projects. We've got to move to renewable energy. We've got to be serious about addressing emissions. Otherwise, we're not going to just lose coral reefs. We're going to lose a lot of our heritage. I mean, just here in Australia, I'm hearing about impacts on the wet tropics in terms of the moist forest, the mountaintops. We're seeing unprecedented bushfires in places like the Blue Mountains and the Tasman wilderness. You know, every World Heritage property in Australia is being impacted. And that's just those in Australia. We haven't yet seen the results of this year's bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef. We know there's bleaching occurring, but whether that will lead to mortality, we don't know. It's too soon to say. But the evidence is not good. We're seeing unprecedented levels of bleaching on the east coast, from Heron Island in the south right up to Lizard Island and further north. And then places out in the Coral Sea, record levels of bleaching. Over in WA, places like Cocos Keeling, record levels of heat stress. So this is happening right around Australia and right around the world. So this is an argument that some people use against climate change. They're saying this is a global issue, therefore we as an individual state property or individual country cannot do anything about it. Well, that's not really the argument. If the values are being impacted, you have to show what you're trying to do to address it. And Australia, as I said, needs to do more to show they're addressing it.
As someone that dives and snorkels on the reef often, it is very upsetting to see coral bleaching occurring in some areas. You've had a long, long career around the reef. How does it feel for you to see this, what's happening?
Well, I'm pretty disappointed that we're not taking the action that we know is required. We are talking about, Band-Aid things to try and fix the problem. And so Australia's spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars and it's not really addressing the key problem. So I think, it's really disappointing to see a place that, I spent most of my career working in and are still pretty passionate about, to see what's, the gradual decline. You've probably heard the term shifting baseline. So managers who come in today won't see it anything like, I saw it when I first dived there, but I'm already seeing a disturbed baseline if I go back to my sort of forebears and ask them what they saw on the reef in terms of fish catches and coral and things like that. It's vastly different. So every generation resets their baseline and, the next generation and your kids and grandkids are just not going to see the reef like we did, which is really sad. It's, I think, important that the industries that rely on a healthy reef also acknowledge it. And we've seen a real turnaround in tourist operators. In the past, they talked about, we don't want to say anything about bleaching because it'll impact our numbers. Now they're actually coming out and saying in danger listing would not be the worst thing facing the reef. It might actually be a catalyst to ensure we get proper protection. So, tourist operators themselves are seeing it. Fishermen are recognising the impacts on their catches. So it's having a huge impact on a whole range of industries. And as I said, unless we get on top of global warming and stabilise it, future generations aren't just going to see anything like what we get to see, which is really sad. And I stress it's not just about what we see, it's implications for industries and for around the world, many people whose livelihoods depend on coral reefs.
It's an urgent warning, but I want to stress to listeners that right now the reef needs action, not despair. And tour operators are doing a really good job of taking people to see parts of the reef which are in a healthy condition. The important thing is there is still hope. We still have healthy parts of the reef which we can save if we act now. It's not too late to make changes and give the reef a future. So on that note, if there's anyone listening that wants to do something to help, even if they don't get to visit the reef all the time like you and I do, what can people do to help protect the Great Barrier Reef?
Well, as we said, every action we take can have an impact. So, just right down to when you jump in the car and go to the shops, if you could walk, take your bike, or perhaps not even go shopping today and do a bit better shopping tomorrow. All these things add to global emissions. And if we all take appropriate steps, we can all contribute to trying to get global emissions down. But I think probably the best thing that most people can do is to vote appropriately. If the current government is not doing what we want, then we need to tell them. We need to tell all the political parties that climate change is the number one issue and we want to see some action to see it addressed.
All Australians value the Great Barrier Reef so highly, and that's why it is so precious to us and why we are lucky enough to have gotten our Great Barrier Reef on the World Heritage List.
Well, may it stay on the World Heritage List. That's the important thing. No, I'm being a bit flippant. The Great Barrier Reef will never be delisted. It will never come off the list. There'll always be some values for which it was listed will be retained. But what I said earlier, and I still maintain, is that we are losing some of the values. So if you look at the Outlook report, it talks about a whole range of species and different habitats. And you look at some of those with a downward trajectory, they're the ones that we're concerned about. So things like seagrass and corals, they are no longer in the state they were when we were inscribed in 1981. They're the ones we've got to worry about. But things like our magnificent beaches like Whitehaven Beach, the fact that we've got incredible islands within the World Heritage Boundary, those islands will always be there.
Yep.
They mightn't look as pristine as they do back in 81. They'll always be there. So the values for the Great Barrier Reef, some values will always be maintained. It'll always be on the World Heritage List. But whether we can retain all the values, and the most important ones being things like corals and species that depend on those coral habitats, they're the ones that we are unfortunately losing through things like bleaching and storm events and acidification and those sort of things.
Dr. John Day, thanks very much for joining us to talk about the reef and the World Heritage Area today. Is there anything else you wanted to mention, or anywhere that you recommend people can go and check out if they want more information?
Well, the Great Barrier Reef has a pretty impressive website, and the Outlook report that I mentioned earlier has an awful lot of information. It's a well laid out and easy to read summation of the values, the threats, and the government response. So I would recommend people look at the Outlook report. It's actually in plain English, quite easy to read with lots of good images to highlight what it's trying to explain. So the Outlook report is available on the web. It's an easy read, and it's an excellent source if, for example, students are doing a project on the Great Barrier Reef. So that's something I think people should look at. But on top of that, the UNESCO World Heritage website has a lot of information about World Heritage, and Queensland also.
Dr. John Day, thanks very much for your time today.
Thanks, Tanya.
I hope you enjoyed our chat with Dr. John Day. If you'd like to take action to help protect the reef, visit www.fightforourreef.org.au. If you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to this series and follow Word on the Reef on Instagram to get notified when it's time for our next adventure. This is a not-for-profit passion project, so if you enjoyed it, please write a review, share, tell your friends, and please consider becoming a patron for as little as $5 a month over at patreon.com/Word on the Reef podcast. You'll get a shout out, and the proceeds will help towards covering costs like podcast hosting, email hosting, editing software subscriptions, and so on. That's all for now. Best fishes, and see you next time.